If this changed how you see your roots, subscribing helps us find more. A geneticist in Mumbai ran the same dataset twice, certain the software had thrown an error. The haplogroup frequencies inside a single Gotra should have clustered tightly. One bloodline, one signal, generation after generation. Instead, the printout showed 4 distinct paternal lineages, sitting under one label, men who called each other kin by an ancestor none of them could actually share on paper. He checked the sample IDs. He checked the reference database against known Eurasian YSTR profiles. The numbers held on the 3rd run. They held on the 4th. What he was looking at wasn't contamination. It was a paternal lineage system that had, for 3,000 years, been quietly failing at the one thing it was built to guarantee. The Gotra system works like this. It passes only from father to son, the same way the Y chromosome passes only from father to son, which means the two should be tracking the exact same line all the way back to a single named ancestor. They aren't. Not even close, in some cases. So if a system built to preserve one bloodline has been letting other bloodlines in for millennia, undetected, unrecorded, what does that mean for the hundreds of millions of people who still use that system today to decide who they're allowed to marry? And which ancestor is actually responsible for the version of the Y chromosome sitting in your own body right now? Before the crack in that system, there's the system itself, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms, because it is not folklore. It is a functioning piece of social engineering that has survived longer than most nation-states. The Gotra system is, at its core, an exogamy rule. A Brahmin man cannot marry a woman from his own Gotra, because anyone sharing that label is treated as bloodkin, no matter how distantly related the families actually are in practice. Each Gotra carries the name of a rishi, a sage, Bharadvaja, Vasishta, Kashyapa, and dozens of others, drawn from genealogical material in later Vedic-era texts, generally dated to somewhere around 1000 to 600 BCE. The tradition holds that every man in a given Gotra descends, father to son, from that one named sage. For that claim to be literally true, the chain would need to survive completely intact for something close to 3,000 years. No adoption altering the line, no quiet non-paternity event, no formal reassignment of Gotra identity at any point across well over 100 generations. And here is what makes the story credible enough to survive this long. Real studies have, in fact, found a statistically significant relationship between Gotra and Y-DNA. A 2025 study of Konkani Sarasvata Brahmins found that paternal lineage tracked with Gotra membership at a significance level of p less than 0.005, a result that is very unlikely to appear by chance. Separately, multiple published surveys have found that a particular Y-DNA haplogroup, R1a, and specifically its Z93 subbranch, dominates among North Indian Brahmin Gotras, including Bharadvaja, Vasishtha, and Kashyapa, which is exactly the pattern you'd expect if a single founding male really did seed each of those lines. Put those two things together and you get the version of the story most people already believe. The system works, the science backs it up, and 3,000 years of oral genealogy essentially checks out. It is a clean story, a complete one, the kind of story that makes a listener nod and move on to the next video. Here is where it gets complicated. Because the same papers that produced that clean correlation also produced a second finding that never makes it into the headline. Not one Gotra tested so far has come back genetically pure. Every single Gotra examined across multiple independent studies contains men carrying more than one Y-DNA haplogroup. Not a rare exception, but a consistent, repeated pattern across different Brahmin communities and different regions of the subcontinent. The Bharadvaja Gotra, one of the largest and most studied, shows this internal diversity clearly across published Y-DNA surveys. Men who share the Gotra name but do not share the paternal marker that name is supposed to guarantee. A 2015 study out of the Gaud Saraswat Brahmin community adds a second, independent data point. Researchers identified a rare R1A1 subclade, designated LPK-STIR, concentrated almost entirely within the male members of one specific founder clan in the town of Latli, in western India. That's a striking result, but notice what it actually proves. It means reliable lineage tracking in that community exists at the level of one family group, not at the level of the broader Gotra label that supposedly covers them all. A third anchor comes from a 2009 comparative study analyzing 510 Y chromosomes, split between 256 Brahmin men and 254 men from scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities, sampled across 6 Indian states. That study found R1A1 concentrated heavily in the Brahmin group relative to the comparison population, a real signal at the level of caste, broadly speaking. But it still does nothing to resolve the mismatch happening one level down, inside individual Gotras. So hold both numbers in your head at once. P less than 0.005 at the population level, and 0 haplogroup purity at the individual level. Both are true. Neither cancels the other out. The name was passed down. The chromosome was not. The story was preserved. The bloodline, in many individual cases, was not. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. The R1A-Z93 clustering and the P0.005 correlation cited 2 minutes ago as proof the system works. That is not separate evidence contradicting a different, weaker study. It is the exact same data set. The confirmation and the contradiction come from the identical research, which means somewhere across 3,000 years, the record was edited, repeatedly, by people who left no trace of having done it. And the only question left is how often, and by whom. The first theory, and the one most geneticists would call the mainstream explanation, doesn't point to fraud at all. It points to something almost mundane: adoption. In traditional Brahmin society, Gotra could be formally reassigned under specific, documented circumstances. An adopted son took on his adoptive father's Gotra, not his biological father's, which means his Y chromosome would mismatch his social Gotra permanently from that point forward. And every one of his male descendants would carry the mismatch too. Run the arithmetic. Even a modest rate of adoption or fostering, compounding across roughly 100 generations since the late Vedic period, using a standard estimate of 25 to 30 years per generation across 3,000 years, is more than enough, mathematically, to produce the level of internal diversity researchers are now finding inside single Gotras. There's supporting texture in the data too. Some analyses find that Pravara, a finer subclassification within Gotra, tracking closer, more recent lineage splits, correlates with Y DNA more strongly than Gotra alone does. Researchers are careful to frame this as consistent with gradual, centuries-long drift rather than proof of any single event. That's the strength of Theory 1. Here's its limit. Adoption, drifting slowly across centuries, explains a gradual loosening of the correlation. It does not comfortably explain cases where the haplogroups sitting inside one Gotra don't just differ slightly. They trace to entirely different, distant branches of the Eurasian Y DNA tree altogether. Some linked to older indigenous South Asian lineages, others linked to Central Asian associated lineages entering the subcontinent at a different time, in a different way. Adoption explains drift. It does not explain distance, not by a little, by a lot. This is the part the records don't explain, and the second theory doesn't touch the last 3,000 years at all. It goes back further, to before the Gotra system even existed in its current form, and asks a harder question. Was the founding rishi of each Gotra ever actually one man? The second explanation, call it the multiple founder theory, suggests that a Gotra label may have been adopted collectively by several already distinct priestly lineages who shared ritual status, geography, or a common teacher, rather than shared blood from a single ancestor. This connects directly to the Vedic Shaka system, the network of ritual schools and teacher lineages that organized Brahmin identity as much around which sacred text tradition a family followed as around strict biological descent. Under that framework, a student formally accepted by a teacher, inheriting that teacher's Gotra as part of the relationship, may have been treated as functionally equivalent to a biological son from the very beginning of the system, not as some later corruption of an originally pure bloodline. There's genetic weight behind this too. Comparative YCTR analysis covering 334 Indian Brahmins against more than 1,300 Eurasian YSDR profiles found that Brahmin groups broadly share a common R1A ancestral signal traced back to Western Iranian populations, likely predating the split between Indo-Iranian language branches in what is now northern Afghanistan. But, and this is the detail that complicates everything, North Indian Brahmin lineages and Southern or Konkani Brahmin lineages appear to represent separate, earlier divergence points, not one shared recent founder splitting apart later. In plain terms, Gotra continuity may predate the north to south dispersal of Brahmin communities across the subcontinent altogether, which means the Gotra label survived a population split that a single biological founder could never have survived intact. If that's right, the entire broken chain framing collapses. There was no unbroken chain to break in the first place. But that raises a stranger problem than the one it solves. If Gotras were multi-founder from the start, why does the data still show any statistically significant correlation at all, 3,000 years later? Here's the quiet complication buried inside that same Theory 1 evidence. The 0.005 correlation used earlier as proof of a single unbroken bloodline is, on closer inspection, equally consistent with several unrelated founding lineages that simply never significantly intermarried with outsiders. The identical statistic supports two completely opposite origin stories, and the data alone cannot tell you which one actually happened. There is a third possibility, and it's the one most published papers only gesture toward, because it's harder to prove and more uncomfortable to state directly. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty. The data doesn't confirm it, it only fails to rule it out. The third theory suggests that some Gotra identity may have been adopted not through blood, not through marriage, and not through a formal teacher-student transfer, but through outright social movement. Families or groups shifting into Brahmin status over the centuries and taking on a Gotra name as part of that transition. What makes this theory hard to dismiss is exactly what the first two theories struggle to explain: the presence of indigenous South Asian Y haplogroups, lineages with no connection to the R1A signal tied to the traditional founder narrative, inside Gotras that claim one single ancient sage as their direct ancestor. Adoption and multi-founder theories both still assume the men involved were already inside the priestly community to begin with. This theory doesn't make that assumption. Most researchers are careful to avoid framing this directly as caste status mobility in their published conclusions, preferring neutral terms like gene flow or admixture event, but the underlying haplogroup data simply does not rule the more direct explanation out. No study has tested this pathway head-on. It remains an inference drawn from the space the other two theories can't quite close. Whichever explanation turns out to be correct, one thing is now certain. Somewhere across 3,000 years, the line between being born into a lineage and becoming part of one got permanently blurred, and a length of DNA sitting in a lab freezer may be the only witness left to when it happened. Picture a riverside settlement along the Ganga-Yamuna Doab during the later Vedic period, somewhere around 3,000 years ago, a landscape shaped by seasonal, river-fed agriculture, the same region where the genealogical and ritual portions of later Vedic literature were composed and passed down orally. A young man arrives at a teacher's household to begin formal study, following the Guru-Shishya tradition documented across Vedic-era texts. He is accepted as a student. As part of that acceptance, he takes on his teacher's Gotra, not because of who fathered him, but because of who agreed to teach him. These residential study periods often ran for years, long enough for a young man's entire social identity, including the ancestral label he'd carry for the rest of his life and pass to his own sons, to fully transfer without anyone treating it as unusual. No scribe flagged it. No later generation questioned it. It was simply how the system worked. That one ordinary, undocumented moment, repeated an unknown number of times across 1,000 years, in villages up and down that river system, is exactly the kind of event that vanishes completely from written tradition, while remaining permanently legible inside a single strand of Y DNA, sitting quietly in a modern man's blood sample, waiting for someone to run the numbers. Here is the detail that recontextualizes everything that came before it. The Gotra system was never designed to be a genetic record in the first place. Genetics is being used to test a system that was built for an entirely different purpose. Gotra's original, primary function was regulating marriage, preventing unions between people treated as kin, and organizing ritual and legal identity within a community. It was never built as a literal, verifiable biological pedigree meant to be checked centuries later by a laboratory. This is where the category error sits. Modern genetic testing treats same Gotra as a testable hypothesis about shared Y DNA. But the people who built and maintained this system for 3,000 years had no concept of a Y chromosome, and no mechanism whatsoever to verify biological descent. The system enforced itself socially, through marriage rules, through community memory, through consequence, never through biology. And that reframes the partial correlation researchers keep finding, again and again, in study after study. P less than 0.005, R1AD93 clustering, a shared Western Iranian ancestral signal. None of that is evidence that the system successfully tracked one bloodline. It's a byproduct of something simpler. Brahmin communities were, for most of this period, largely endogamous at the level of caste as a whole, which means some degree of shared ancestry was almost guaranteed regardless of whether any individual Gotra label was ever biologically accurate. The science isn't confirming the tradition. It isn't debunking it either. It's revealing that Gotra and Y-DNA were always two separate systems, one social, one biological, that overlapped by cultural design, never by biological necessity, and the overlap was always going to be partial. A researcher working on one of these Brahmin lineage studies put it to a colleague more plainly than any paper would print. The label tells you what a family believed about itself. The chromosome tells you what actually happened to it. The two were never obligated to agree, which means every man who takes a DNA test today, expecting it to confirm or deny his Gotra, is asking a question the system was never built to answer, and no study on record can tell him which of his ancestors made the choice, generations back, that quietly changed his line forever. Widen this out past India, and the same pattern shows up everywhere humans have tried to turn oral genealogy into biology. Clan names, surnames, patrilineal titles carried across dozens of unrelated cultures on every populated continent. All of them show the identical shape when tested. A real, statistically significant correlation with Y-DNA, sitting alongside individual-level exceptions that oral tradition never recorded, and, in most cases, never could have. This isn't a flaw unique to Indian genealogy. It's what happens whenever any culture builds an identity system around fatherhood and lets it run for enough centuries. Inside a species where adoption, remarriage, and quiet exceptions have always existed, everywhere, in every era. The DNA didn't answer whether any one man's Gotra is true. It proves something larger and less comfortable, that the question itself assumes a level of biological precision that no ancient record-keeping system, anywhere in the world, was ever built to guarantee. Think of it less like a courtroom document and more like a river that's been renamed by every community living along its banks for 3,000 years. The water underneath keeps moving, mixing, picking up new tributaries no one bothered to mark on the map, while the name on the sign at the bridge stays exactly the same. Same Gotra, different Y-DNA, and somewhere upstream, in a generation with no name and no record, an ancestor made a choice that the water is still carrying today.